Okay, we begin our story in Lebanon, 2005. The sun is pretty hot, even though it's just February. In Beirut, the city seems busy, alive, chaotic, messy. People going about their day like any other day. As we're in that scene, a motorcade passes by. Pretty big motorcade. It would be noisy, it'd be loud, because, as we're going to find out, specific type of car. So, hot day, old buildings, everybody rushing around on foot, and a busy motorcade gliding through. That is, until it explodes. That is the introduction, my introduction, to the Mehlis Report. Now, interestingly enough, to skip ahead a few bits, that's not how the book starts. The book actually follows the structure of following the life of a man called Saman Yerid. We don't see the events of the killing of Prime Minister Rafik Hariri that lead to the Mehlis Report. We just see the aftermath. But I thought a little introduction, setting the scene of the days leading up to the start of this story would be helpful. So, as I said, the Mehlis Report, that's what emerges from this event, and that's what sparks this book and its title. So, it is named after this very famous report, especially at the time, which is named after Detlev Mehlis, who was a German prosecutor brought in by the UN to investigate the killing of Lebanese ex-Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005, in February, as the scene was set. So, our story does not begin there, as I've already said. It begins slightly later in the year, with the perspective of Saman, a 40-year-old architect who lived in Beirut his whole life, following the city in the aftermath of this event. So he's wandering in between his work as an architect, his home life in this really ancient family mansion, and exploring the city as he goes and taking us with him. So our story explores his relationships with other people in this city in the aftermath. And through those relationships, we learn about the impact on the whole city through his personal relationships. And those personal relationships extend from family, writing to family abroad, big theme, or women he's sort of in love with. You don't really get the full picture, but he's semi in love with. Okay, so we're exploring the aftermath of this event through his personal relationships. And really, the whole thing is just that. It's like a love letter almost to his city of Beirut and to his country of Lebanon. And we see Lebanon through this main character, Saman, his love for a late night walk or a drive through the city. A genius guy, I know. We see it through his personal history, his family history, and his experience. We follow him in the pretty fertile atmosphere of the city after these events, all the way up to the final 24 hours of the report, the Mehlis Report, that this book is named after. But in order to understand why this specific few months in Lebanese history is so interesting, you kind of do need a little bit of history to set it up. So I'm going to do a very, very, very brief overview of why you should care about this specific moment. So, we are going all the way back. Quick zoom all the way to partition. So, Lebanon, a country with rich history, diverse cultures, and deep-rooted traditions, as we will see. But its modern story is, one of the most complicated you could possibly imagine. You have a partition from a French mandate into an independent country. Independent country that is essentially a third Christian, third Sunni, third Shia at the time of partition, and a governing structure based around one party holds presidency, one party holds prime ministership, one party holds Speaker of the House, divided among three post-partition. And really, creation of modern Lebanon is post-World War I, stay with me. It's really post-World War II, but World War One is helpful. So you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which means the whole Middle East is getting redrawn. And then in 1920, Lebanon, as I said, is placed under French mandate. Now, mandate, kind of fancy word for they occupy it, with some international backing. The French influence is really important for the story, for the city, for the country. I mean, you will hear French street names, French buildings, references to France. There's a family member who lives in France now. The whole story is influenced by that. And the boundaries that are drawn then, during and after 1920, with the French mandate, are important to the structure of it today. And then, as we move towards World War II, after World War II, you get towards independence. So, after those years of French control, 23 to be exact, in 1943, Lebanon is declared an independent nation, or I should say, declares itself an independent nation. I'm going to read so I don't get this wrong. The creation of the Lebanese National Pact between Christian and Muslim leaders became the cornerstone of the new nation's political system, as I said earlier, establishing a unique power-sharing agreement between those three parties, that is, the two different types of Islam. The pact divided key political positions among sectarian lines, as I said: President, Christian Maronite, Prime Minister, Sunni Muslim, Speaker of the Parliament, Shia Muslim. So that's the separation. And then, pretty quickly and importantly for this story and for the whole history, things go back pretty quick. So all the way up to 1975, peace kind of holds, not fully, but I won't go into detail. But Civil War really breaks out 1975, and it's a brutal civil war. So there's tensions between different religious sects, different groups. The Civil War, basically a brutal one among sectarian lines in a country that's that divided, and it goes on for 15 years, all the way to 1990. So I said 1990, insanely long. And it only ends with this Taif agreement in 1989, which is when it's signed. Peace really kicks in 1990. So, as with many important documents, it's signed in Saudi Arabia in 1989, as I've said. The deal ends the civil war, but it doesn't resolve all of the different sectarian issues, doesn't address any of the power structures, just ends that specific conflict. But things are not that simple. That's internal. Externally, a whole different story. And that is the Syrian occupation. Syria, which will have an even greater influence than France on Lebanon. Pretty important player in this whole story, especially for the Mehlis Report. So, I'm going to read once again. After the civil war, Syria maintained a strong military presence in Lebanon, as I've said. This occupation was formalised in the early 1990s, but remained controversial throughout. Syria's influence over Lebanese politics and military operations lasted until 2005. That is, on a broad sense. On a smaller scale, kind of continues today, but formal Syrian influence ends 2005 with the death of Rafik Hariri, sort of a powerful, independent Lebanese prime minister who's killed in 2005. Investigation into him. Spoiler. This is a spoiler. Not really for the book, for the story, the real story. Syria is basically found guilty of his killing, so their influence ends 2005. So, as I've said, that's the present day for us in the story, 2005, when everything changes with the death of Rafik Hariri, who's, like a giant political figure in post-war Lebanon. His death sparks massive protests across the country and a deep sense of gloom, as this book explores. That's what it's all about. It's that feeling of the Lebanese people after his death. So something called the Cedar Revolution in that same year basically is people demanding the end of Syria's influence and control over Lebanon, and they kind of succeed in April 2005, and Syria basically withdraws. So, to understand why Rafik Hariri and his death is so important, we have to take a look at the guy himself. So, Rafik Hariri, we have to take a look at him, basically because he's the one who sets it all off. So, he is most interesting for this premise and for this book because of the reputation afforded to him by the point of his death and this book, 2005. By 2005, he is extremely famous. He was a Lebanese businessman who turned to politics. He was the first post-Civil War Prime Minister of Lebanon after that really long, 15 years long Civil War, so massively important. So he has an enormous political stature, but it's not just his stature that wins him support. He was also, reportedly, one of the key members of the cabinet that helped secure that Taif agreement in 1989/90 that secured peace. So not only is he seen as powerful, he's directly associated with peace. So obviously his death is a massive deal. Really a massive deal. And all of that is what makes the novel's premise of the report and the investigation and the feeling and the mood after his death. All of that story of him is what makes this novel so good. It's the background that allows this novel to not get into politics, not get into detail, just be a pure novel about someone's life. It's set at the moment before the storm and after, so he's died, but you don't know if worse is coming. As I've said, he dies, but that begs the question, who killed him? Since the novel doesn't actually tell you, I thought it would only be fair to tell you who basically did it. So, interestingly, the Mehlis Report is actually preceded by a different UN report called the Fitzgerald Report, which was a result of an inquiry by UN Secretary General, and that's commissioned and conducted by the UN and conducted by an Irish policeman. That's cool. But then the Mehlis Report is the really big one, which is carried out by a German prosecutor, Detlef Mehlis, and it was published late October 2005. It's the result of a UN security resolution, and which shows his death is internationally important outside of Lebanon. The whole process of investigating his death was really thorough and difficult, so it involved interviews with senior members of the Syrian and Lebanese governments throughout the year. And then, in December 2005, as the UN leant heavily on Syria as a suspect, its case came under scrutiny. A main witness, this is so strange, a main witness for the report, named Hussam Tahir Hussam, was publicly identified and recantified his testimony, claiming bribery and torture by Lebanese interests to get him to testify against Syria. What? He's claiming people bribed him to talk against Syria. Strange. And it gets stranger. So, he's claimed that people have bribed him to get the terrorists to testify, but against Syria. Then, the Mehlis Report Commission released receipts. He got pressured by Syria to make this story up because it revealed information that his family and friends back in Syria had been threatened. Crazy. And then, in another strange story here, a phone dealer in Tripoli, big city, who is called Nawar Habib Donna, sold 5 of the 8 phones that were used to carry out the explosive attack on his motorcade. He was killed in an apparent car accident in November 2005. A little bit suspicious. Just a little bit, just saying. So, not shockingly for our characters in the novel, they completely expect this. The Mehlis Report doesn't make any mention of anyone in the Syrian government as responsible, no specifics. And a big part of the novel is that people there not surprised by that. We are surprised as an audience, but they expected this. But there is more interesting turn and a more dramatic one, which is that the report was first erroneously released as a Microsoft Word document, which kept old changes, which made the document. These old changes are pretty damning. So according to the original document, the UN report specifically named many high-ranking Syrian government and military officials as being personally responsible for the death of Rafiq Hariri. There's those specifics. That and the witness intimidation suggest that there were Syrian attempts to stifle the report and internal decisions to limit the fallout. All of that was meant basically the report was pretty impossible to ever indict those who were truly guilty. On that example of the suspicious circumstances around the report specifics, it initially named 4 officials in the Syrian and Lebanese government as suspicious. However, what people reveal, and the original names reveal, is even though they're Syrian and Lebanese, all of the Lebanese ones have ties to the Syrian state, including one of them who was a brother of a relative of President Bashar al-Assad. Suspicious. Very suspicious. Okay, so, names removed. Some people suggest that the document, the original one that is, indicates the report was going to name names, but that at a meeting, the UN Secretary General, who was called Kofi Annan, stated that, there's going to be specifics, there's going to be details. I'm not going to go back on that. These people are suggesting that the original document suggests that he covered it up. Very suspicious. But, yeah. So, in the end, there's a kind of mystery that remains, but everyone really knows who did it. The report is, as the novel sets out, not groundbreaking as revelations to ordinary people, but the after effects of this are enormous. So eventually 4 Hezbollah members of Unit 121 were indicted for the assassination. So they do secure some prosecutions eventually, and on a much wider scale, as I've said, it's a catalyst for dramatic change, the Cedar Revolution, everything, through to April 2005, that helps achieve the withdrawal of Syria from Lebanon. So all of that is the really dramatic context for why this little bit of history, before the release of the report but after his death, is so interesting. So, now, obviously context is not everything. If it's a novel, the writing style has to live up to it, right? That's fundamentally what it's about, and that's where the novel excels, because that's the reason it's a really good read, it's a really interesting read. Is you could have wasted the amazing setting, as amazing it is, if you weren't a good writer, you could have wasted it, and he does not whatsoever, launches in, makes the most of it. So, it is, as I've said, written primarily around a man called Samad Yurid, 40-year-old guy. It's a deeply personal story, as opposed to, this title that suggests it's everything. No, it's really specific. It doesn't avoid the subject of the Mehlis Report. It's central to the framing of the story, but it's not an everyday thing that the characters are thinking about or imagining or focused on whatsoever. They're aware of it, but they're not focused on it. So, all that begs the question, who is Samad Yurid, our protagonist, our character, and why is he interesting? So we are introduced pretty early, from the start, to Samad's wider family, who have almost all left Lebanon. He's got 2 sisters, one called Mary, one called Emily. The most important part that we get introduced to early is that he's 40. He's the only one left living alone in this big ancestral home. The home, which is beautiful, it's built by a family of architects, his family. It's the anchor for the story, it's the base of exploring the place. And that's useful because so much of the story is set in ruins of Beirut, his lover's house, a random market. You need a central location to come back to, and that's it. So he's introduced to us as basically a 40-year-old, living as a 20-year-old. He lives alone. It seems like he barely works. He goes out walking all the time. Very strange, very strange. strange. But anyway, he's basically a free of responsibilities because of his generational wealth person who's also versed in the history of the place. So, like, the person with the most amount of time to explore, which is what you need in a novel. So, perfectly crafted for that. All of that is what makes him, useful as a perspective for the early 2000s specifically, because he would have grown up, he's 40 by now, would have grown up with that 15 years of war, that piece. Then this gives you the full breadth of the perspective. That family links him to the city, and that makes him useful to explore Beirut in particular, because so much of the story is about Beirut specifically, not all of that wrong. So, assuming he is interesting and useful as a character, what happens? What actually goes on with him? Once again, what happens to him in the present is only like a small part of the true story. He seems to be quite a paradoxical person. He's falling for different people. He's learning to cook. Apparently he's never cooked before, so like he's loving life at times. At other times he's caught in the past. So throughout the story he experiences sadness of what's happening to this place because, as we learn, it's a personal sadness and a societal. Most of the time it's societal. But then there's moments like when we learn that he actually had a third sister who died during that civil war. So then you see he's societally worried about the effects, but also it always comes back to the personal, which makes the story interesting because it's not abstract. So the ghost of that sister is a useful, like, humanizing plotline to express, the lasting scars of the Civil War for a reader who might not, think about that, know about that, have a particular emotional attachment to that. And on the note of her ghost, singular, just one ghost, it's a good time to discuss the theme of the life that we're exploring, his life. So from the ghosts that haunt him throughout the narrative, real ghosts with their own chapters, to the ruined city around him, the whole novel is based around death. Death is like the most central part. Okay, so there is the ghosts in the narrative, as I've said, the ghost of his older sister, different previous deaths that have come to him, and all of those ghosts represent the theme of death in the narrative, which is like so central because he sees personal death, as I've said, sees societal death, and emotional death for the place that he loves. And you cannot escape death, even in his happiest moments. So when he's learning to cook and he's having dinner with his sort of wife, in the most happy moment, death is like still on his mind, 24/7, and it's all consuming in this place, even though the city itself is described more as a living thing, and it's the setting of the mood for all of the people within it. It's not only that, it's central to the theme of the story. This place, specifically Beirut, and the city is pretty much alive, and for some man, he always feels like it is. And with the city being a living thing, you can see everything that happens as part of that personification. So the explosions that rip it in 2005, those are like wounds on the body of this living thing in his perspective. So with the city as that living thing, those explosions, every time he thinks there's going to be another explosion, it's like an attack on that body that he knows. And linking all of those things to the city, that pain, death, and the land of the living and the dead, all of that is contained by writing. And it's kind of like a meta point about writing that the author is trying to make. Author who's called Rabi Jabbar, by the way, born in 1972, just for a little while of him. And all of the dead in this world end up writing a page-long autobiography. of their own life. But even some of the dead, they go on beyond that. In the book, the dead will be writing whole books, and they're always reading. So for the author, clearly, like, writing is a key part of life, and he actually says that publicly. So in one particular passage, he hates on, basically, someone who is writing for personal gain. And the passage is, here is a man who used to write for personal gain, not for the love of writing. He used to write for the sake of prestige. In his world, he used to only write a single sentence. I wrote so as not to choke. Basically, he always wrote for personal gain. He dies. Now he's writing to just survive. Karma, basically, in the author's mind. Retribution for how he acted about writing.